At the couples therapy session, my wife told the therapist, "I've been faking it for years. He's just not man enough." I nodded, shook the doctor's hand, and left. That evening, she found divorce papers and her credit card canceled. She's been calling me sobbing. I, 34M, walked into Dr. Martinez's office that Tuesday evening thinking we were going to save our marriage. After 6 months of couples therapy, I genuinely believed we were making progress. My wife sat in her usual spot on the beige couch, legs crossed, that familiar distant look in her eyes. I settled beside her, close enough to appear united but far enough that our knees wouldn't accidentally touch. That should have been my first clue. Dr. Martinez opened her notebook and asked us about the homework from last week. We were supposed to have 3 meaningful conversations about our intimacy issues. I started explaining how I tried to initiate those talks, but my wife cut me off with a sharp laugh that made my stomach drop. She looked directly at the therapist and said something that shattered my world. She told Dr. Martinez that she'd been faking it for years, that I just wasn't man enough for her. The words hung in the air like poison gas. She said it so casually, as if she was commenting on the weather, not destroying everything I thought I knew about our relationship. I felt my face burn with humiliation. Here was the woman I'd spent 7 years with, the person I'd trusted with my deepest insecurities, telling a stranger that our entire intimate life had been a performance. She continued, explaining to Dr. Martinez how she'd been pretending to be satisfied, how she'd been going through the motions because she felt sorry for me. The therapist's face remained professionally neutral, but I caught her glancing at me with what looked like pity. That made it worse somehow. I sat there processing what I'd just heard, my mind racing through every intimate moment we'd shared, wondering which parts were real and which were just her putting on a show. My wife kept talking, detailing how inadequate I was as a partner, how she tried to help me improve but eventually gave up. She spoke about me like I wasn't even sitting right there, like I was some case study she was presenting to the doctor. The clinical way she dissected our relationship made my blood run cold. I realized she wasn't trying to fix anything. This wasn't a cry for help or a desperate attempt to communicate. This was her exit strategy. She was building her case for why she needed to leave, using our therapist as a witness to my failures as a man. Something shifted inside me then. The hurt began crystallizing into something harder, clearer. I looked at this woman who'd shared my bed for 7 years and saw a stranger. Someone who'd been lying to me every single day, who'd let me believe I was making her happy while secretly cataloging my shortcomings. When she finally finished her devastating monologue, Dr. Martinez turned to me, probably expecting me to defend myself or break down. Instead, I did something that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I nodded calmly, stood up, and shook Dr. Martinez's hand. I thanked her for her time and walked out. Behind me, I could hear my wife calling my name, her voice suddenly uncertain. For the first time in months, I didn't turn around. I walked to my car with my shoulders straight and drove home in complete silence, my mind already shifting from devastated husband to strategic planner. That evening, while she was still at the office working late as usual, I made some calls. My lawyer had been expecting this conversation for months, he said. Apparently, my friends had seen signs I'd been blind to. He walked me through the process, and I signed the papers that night. California's no-fault divorce laws meant her admission in therapy wouldn't matter legally, but I didn't care. This wasn't about winning in court. I also called the credit card company. Technically, it was my account with her as an authorized user. The representative was surprisingly helpful when I explained I needed to remove someone's access immediately. Within an hour, her cards were canceled. Next, I called my bank and moved our joint savings into an individual account. Everything we'd built together, all those years of shared financial goals and dreams, reduced to a series of calculated moves designed to protect myself from further damage. I changed the locks on our house, the one I'd bought before we met, the one she'd gradually filled with her things until it felt more like hers than ours. I packed her belongings methodically, focusing on the practical aspects to keep my emotions in check. 7 years of shared life fit into 12 boxes and 3 suitcases. By midnight, I'd systematically dismantled our life together. I felt hollow but oddly calm, like a surgeon who'd successfully removed a tumor. The pain would come later, but right now I was running on pure efficiency. When she came home around 10 p.m., she found the locks changed and her belongings on the front porch. The divorce papers were tucked neatly into her jewelry box, along with a note explaining that her credit cards had been canceled and she'd need to find somewhere else to stay. My phone started ringing immediately. I let it go to voicemail the first few times, then turned it off entirely. I didn't want to hear her voice right then. I needed this quiet space to process what had happened, to start figuring out who I was going to be now that everything I'd believed about my marriage had been revealed as an elaborate lie. The next morning brought a flood of messages. She'd apparently spent the night at her sister's place, and the reality of her situation was starting to sink in. The voicemails began with anger. How could I do this to her? How could I be so cruel? Didn't I want to talk about what happened in therapy? But as the day wore on, the tone changed. The anger gave way to panic as she realized I was serious, that this wasn't some dramatic gesture designed to get her attention. She started calling from different numbers when I blocked her main one. Her friends began reaching out, asking me to reconsider, telling me that couples could work through anything. By the third day, her calls had turned desperate. She was sobbing, begging me to talk to her, promising she hadn't meant what she'd said in therapy. She claimed she was just frustrated, that she'd exaggerated because she wanted Dr. Martinez to understand how stuck we both felt in our relationship. But I kept thinking about how easily she'd said those words, how naturally the cruelty had flowed from her lips. That wasn't frustration talking. That was her truth finally coming out. She'd been carrying those thoughts about me for years, nursing them in secret while playing the role of a loving wife. Her sister showed up at my office, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. She insisted my wife loved me, that I was throwing away a good marriage over one bad moment in therapy. I listened politely, then asked her how long she'd known about her sister's feelings. The way she couldn't meet my eyes told me everything I needed to know. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into projects with an intensity that surprised my colleagues. My boss pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay at home, and I gave him the simplified version. My wife and I were divorcing, but I was handling it well. He offered me time off, which I declined. Staying busy kept the darker thoughts at bay. Update 1. A week after the therapy session, my lawyer called with interesting news. My wife had hired her own attorney and was demanding spousal support, claiming she'd sacrificed her career advancement for our marriage. This was rich, considering she'd always been more ambitious than me and had actually gotten promoted twice during our relationship. Her lawyer also demanded access to our joint accounts, apparently not realizing I'd already legally separated our finances. My lawyer explained that since the house was in my name before marriage and we had no children, California law was actually on my side for most things. She was entitled to half of what we'd accumulated during marriage, but I'd been smart about documentation. That same week, she started showing up at places she knew I'd be. The grocery store near our house, the gym where I'd been a member for years, even the coffee shop where I met friends on weekends. Each time, she'd try to corner me for a conversation I wasn't ready to have. At the grocery store, she appeared in the cereal aisle looking haggard and desperate. She started talking rapidly about how she'd made a mistake, how therapy had made her say things she didn't mean. She grabbed my arm and begged me to come home so we could work things out properly. I gently removed her hand and told her we could communicate through our lawyers. The look on her face, like I'd slapped her, almost broke my resolve. But then I remembered sitting in that therapy office, listening to her catalog my inadequacies for a stranger, and my determination hardened again. The gym confrontation was worse. She waited by my car in the parking lot, tears streaming down her face, insisting that we could go to a different therapist, that she'd do anything to fix what she'd broken. She looked so small and broken that part of me wanted to comfort her, the way I had countless times during our marriage. But I realized that was exactly the pattern that had gotten us here. She would hurt me, then I would comfort her, and nothing would actually change. I was done being her emotional caretaker while she slowly destroyed my self-worth. Her friends launched a coordinated campaign, each one reaching out to tell me I was making a mistake. They painted her as a victim of her own honesty, suggested that brutal truth-telling was actually a sign of trust in our relationship. One friend even implied I was being overly sensitive, that most men would appreciate a wife who was direct about their needs. That one particularly stung because it echoed my own insecurities. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe strong relationships really did involve this level of harsh honesty. But then I'd remember the context. She hadn't been trying to help me improve. She'd been building a case for why our marriage was doomed. My own friends were more supportive, though some urged me to slow down. They pointed out that divorce was a huge step, that maybe marriage counseling with a different therapist could help. But they hadn't been in that room, hadn't heard the casual cruelty in her voice as she dismantled everything I thought we'd built together. Update 2. 2 weeks post-therapy, the legal proceedings were moving faster than expected. My wife's demands for spousal support were becoming increasingly desperate as her lawyer realized how little leverage she actually had. She'd moved in with her sister permanently, and apparently, that living situation wasn't going well. Her sister called me directly, bypassing both lawyers to tell me I was destroying 2 lives with my stubbornness. She painted a picture of my wife barely eating, crying constantly, unable to function at work. Part of me felt guilty until I reminded myself that actions have consequences. But the real breakthrough came when I ran into Dr. Martinez at a coffee shop near her office. She couldn't discuss our session directly due to confidentiality, but she did make an observation that hit me like a truck. She mentioned that in her experience, people who could be that deliberately cruel to someone they supposedly loved often harbored deeper resentments that went far beyond whatever surface issues they were discussing. She suggested that my wife's behavior in that session might have been calculated rather than impulsive. That thought had been lurking in the back of my mind, but hearing it from a professional made it real. My wife hadn't had a moment of brutal honesty. She'd planned to humiliate me. That evening, I finally listened to all her voicemails from the past 2 weeks. What struck me wasn't just the desperation, but the progression of her arguments. First, she'd insisted she hadn't meant what she said. Then she claimed it was just frustration. Next, she argued that she'd been trying to shock us both into addressing our problems. But in the most recent messages, she'd started admitting that maybe she had meant some of it, but only because she loved me so much and wanted me to be the best version of myself. The goalpost kept moving, and each explanation contradicted the last. I realized she was cycling through different strategies to see what would work on me. The tears, the anger, the bargaining, the justifications, none of it was genuine remorse for what she'd done. She was just trying to find the right key to unlock my forgiveness so she could go back to her comfortable life. That night, I called my lawyer and told him to stop engaging with settlement negotiations. I wanted the divorce finalized as quickly as possible. He warned me that this might make things more expensive if she decided to fight harder, but I didn't care. Every day this dragged on was another day she could try to manipulate me into backing down. Update 3. 1 month after the therapy session that ended my marriage, I was starting to build a new routine. I joined a different gym, found new grocery stores, basically rebuilt my daily life to avoid unwanted encounters. It felt good to reclaim my space and time. The divorce was proceeding smoothly until my wife pulled her last desperate move. She showed up at my office building with what looked like a carefully planned performance. She'd clearly lost weight, her clothes hung loose, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping. Security called me down to the lobby where she was waiting with a letter she insisted I read immediately. The letter was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, detailing how she'd realized she'd been wrong about everything, how losing me had made her understand what real love meant. But what caught my attention wasn't the content, it was the presentation. The letter was typed and formatted perfectly, with no typos or grammatical errors. This wasn't a desperate woman pouring her heart onto paper at 3 a.m. This was a calculated document designed to achieve a specific result. I handed the letter back to her and told security she wasn't welcome in the building anymore. As I walked away, I heard her calling after me, her voice echoing in the marble lobby, but I didn't turn around. I was done being the audience for her performances. That evening, my lawyer called with news that shouldn't have surprised me, but did. My wife had hired a private investigator to look into my finances and personal life, apparently hoping to find evidence of an affair or hidden assets that would strengthen her position in the divorce. The investigator had been thorough but found nothing because there was nothing to find. I'd been faithful throughout our marriage and transparent about our money. But the fact that she'd gone this route told me everything I needed to know about who she really was under the mask she'd worn for 7 years. Her sister made one final attempt at mediation, inviting me to lunch under the pretense of returning some of my belongings that had apparently been mixed in with my wife's things. But instead of my stuff, She brought a photo album filled with pictures from happier times in our marriage. She flipped through the pages slowly, pointing out moments that had seemed perfect, asking me how I could throw away all those good memories because of one bad day in therapy. But as I looked at those photos, all I could think about was that my wife had been faking it in every single one. Every smile, every tender moment, every intimate gesture had been a performance for my benefit. Those weren't good memories anymore. They were evidence of an elaborate deception that had lasted years. I left the restaurant halfway through lunch. I was done being guilted into maintaining relationships with people who'd helped facilitate the biggest lie of my life. Final update. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks after that therapy session. My wife had eventually accepted a fair settlement rather than drag things out further, probably because her lawyer realized they had no winning strategy. She got half of our shared assets accumulated during marriage, and I kept the house and my retirement accounts that predated our relationship. At the final hearing, she tried one last time to make eye contact, to convey some message I was no longer interested in receiving. I looked straight ahead and listened to the judge make our divorce official with the same attention I'd give to any other legal proceeding. Afterward, outside the courthouse, she approached me one final time. She said she hoped someday I'd be able to forgive her, that she'd learned so much about herself through this process, and that she wanted me to be happy even if it wasn't with her. I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it. Not because I was ready to forgive her, but because I was ready to stop caring about her approval or her emotional state. She'd been the center of my emotional universe for 7 years, and now she was just another person I used to know. As I walked to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, genuine excitement about the future. I was 34 years old with a stable career, a house I loved, and the hard-won knowledge that I deserved better than someone who could look me in the eye while lying about the most intimate parts of our relationship. The woman who'd told a therapist I wasn't man enough was wrong about a lot of things, but she'd been accidentally right about one thing. I deserved a relationship where I didn't have to wonder if my partner was faking it. I was finally free to find that, and I'd never settle for less again. My phone stopped ringing weeks ago. The desperate voicemails stopped coming. Sometimes I wonder if she's moved on, if she's found someone who meets her unstated standards, if she's learned to be honest from the start instead of building relationships on elaborate deceptions. But mostly, I don't wonder about her at all anymore. That's probably the best revenge of all, becoming genuinely indifferent to someone who once held so much power over my happiness. I'd rather be alone than with someone who saw loving me as a burden she had to bear in secret. The therapy session that was supposed to save our marriage actually saved me instead, just not in the way anyone expected. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us. Please subscribe.